So thanks a lot, Joel, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'd like to spend a few minutes giving you a very quick summary of a report which we just released today titled Ebb and Flow, Volume 1, Water, Migration and Development. And you can download it at the link that you see on the screen. We're really grateful to the Global Water Security and Sanitation Partnership, GWSP, for supporting this work. So as Joel mentioned, migration is big news. It has shaped and carries on reshaping our world in myriad ways. The numbers are staggering and speak for themselves. Currently, there are over 1 billion migrants in the world. But what you may not know is that approximately 3/4 are migrants that move within their country's national borders. And water has the power to shape these migration patterns, perhaps more than you think. Rains, rivers, coasts, and seas have always determined where people have settled. And even today, satellite images at night show you how the bright city lights illuminate the Nile River Valley and Delta. And with climate change, understanding how water influences these migration patterns has become even more important. The latest IPCC report just released has reiterated that climate change is an irreversible force and is adding stresses to the water cycle. By the end of the century, according to some estimates, 2/3 of the Earth's land is already on pace to lose water as the climate warms. And because of that, 700 million people could be affected by extreme drought. But the impacts of climate change are not some threat on the distant horizon. As you all know, they are happening here and now. Climate change is already making rainfall more variable, more fickle, and it's causing more extreme events. So what we do in Ebb and Flow is look back into the recent past and take this intensifying growing water scarcity together with water variability and explore the impacts on internal migration and development by asking 3 questions. The first obvious question to ask is why? Why and in what context do water shocks impact migration? The next question we asked is who? Who migrates due to water shocks, since people are central to this? And finally, what are the impacts and where do they occur? But before turning to the why, who, and where, a more fundamental question must be asked. How much of a role does water even play in global migration? In particular, what is the role of the rainfall shocks and the droughts that I just described? To answer this question, we harness the power of machine learning and big data. We employ the largest data set on internal migration ever assembled from over 442 million individuals from 189 different population censuses in 64 countries between 1960 and 2015, spanning 55 years. So what did we learn? Well, we learned that in addition to the traditional demographic drivers of migration, periods of rainfall deficit are also significant predictors of population movements. But, and there is a big but, the range of influence can vary considerably. There is a lot of variation across countries and regions, and so this really cautions against making any sweeping conclusions. So now that we have a 10,000-foot view with the machine learning analysis, let's dig deeper into the data and evidence to understand what's happening on the ground. And to do so, several national and global level data sets were combined, such as global precipitation data covering the extent of the 20th and 21st century, data sets that link cities to their water sources, spatially disaggregated data on local migration rates, household surveys, and government censuses, to data on nighttime lights to track economic activity. So what do we find? Let's turn to the first question of why. Why and in what context do water shocks induce migration? If I were to ask you, Why did you migrate? This most straightforward question you will find is perhaps the hardest to answer. Every migrant has a unique story and experience, and people's choices to move or stay, they occur within a context of a wide array of personal, social, cultural factors and other macro considerations. But at its economic core, the decision boils down to two salient questions. Will I be better off in the long run if I choose to migrate? The incentive condition. And do I have the means to migrate? The affordability condition. What we find is that to avoid the ravages of drought, some people do decide to move away, and migration can act as a release valve when droughts induce income shocks. In fact, rainfall-induced water deficits result in 5 times as much migration as water excess. But there are important nuances in why and when this migration occurs. Not everyone has the option to move. Where there is extreme poverty and migration is costly, repeated droughts can stress household finances even further, leaving people with fewer resources to recover or move for jobs. The poorest are 4 times less likely to be able to move than higher income residents. And these populations who are left behind are often hidden from media headlines, yet they represent a policy concern that is just as serious. So how can we respond? How can we protect livelihoods at the source that largely happen to be rural areas? Well, broadly, the choice of policies to manage water risks at the source can be classified into 3 broad categories. Water storage and supplemental irrigation through physical infrastructure, if weighed carefully to avoid unintended consequences, can buffer vulnerable rural communities from water variability and scarcity. Climate-smart agriculture and farmer-led irrigation can play similar roles while minimizing the environmental footprint. And alongside built infrastructure, we have natural capital or green infrastructure, such as watersheds and their associated forests, that can enhance the resilience and quality of water supplies, and they may also provide drought-proof sources of income to the poor. And so investing in their preservation can therefore provide long-term benefits. But despite these solutions, inevitably some residual risks will remain. And therefore adaptive safety nets are critical as a last backstop to prevent severe deprivation when water shocks hit. Let's turn to the second question of who migrates due to water shocks. As we just saw, droughts can trap poor people in low-income countries, but they tend to induce migration in middle-income countries. But water shocks affect not only the number of people who move, but also the skills they bring with them. And because of that, the movement of people is really the movement of human capital. And this movement of human capital is the key channel through which migration shapes regional development. Usually, highly skilled workers tend to move to more productive regions to earn higher wages. The report finds that workers who are pushed into cities and are escaping droughts usually possess lower education levels and skills than other migrant workers. This means that they face lower wages and a wage gap of up to 3.4% when they arrive at the destination. This evidence is seen across multiple middle-income countries. Not only do these migrants face lower wages, but in turn, they also have poorer access to housing and basic services. So what can be done? Even as these migrants may still be better off because migration allowed them to adapt to the risks of water variability in the absence of other options, there are still fundamental ingredients that are needed for migrant integration. No regret policies, like building human capital and investing in worker productivity through education, can act as a portable asset that moves with people wherever they go. We also need to invest in basic services, water supply and sanitation, and safe housing for poor migrants in urban areas. And finally, alongside investments in worker education, active labor market policies are also needed to enable migrants to find the best opportunities. Let's turn to the last question of what are the impacts and where do they occur? Cities are the destination of most internal migrants, but cities are not immune to water shocks, quite the contrary. High-profile urban droughts in Cape Town, Sao Paulo, and Chennai show that some of the world's megacities are increasingly facing day zero events when water supplies become threateningly low. But dozens of smaller cities across the globe also face day zero type events, but they don't make international headlines. And this map shows you these cities, big and small, that have faced the deepest water deficit over the period of study. The larger the dot, the larger and more sustained the deficit. And as you can see, cities with big deficits are spread out throughout much of the developing world. What we find is that such water shortages can significantly slow urban growth, compounding the vulnerability of migrants. If you turn your gaze to the chart, you will see that as the dry water shock magnitude increases from left to right, city growth shown in the black line also declines linearly and steadily. And it can decline by up to 12%, in turn reducing the quality of life for residents and recent migrants alike. Thus, paradoxically, migrants who travel to cities to avoid the impacts of rainfall variability may in fact find themselves in cities that offer fewer economic opportunities and critical services due to these water deficits. So how can we preserve and sustain water resources in cities? Adaptation to day zero type events that I just described can be expensive, and therefore it is critical that decision makers carefully weigh the options available to them. Although in some cases supply expansion will be critical, truly solving the problem in the long term will require demand management. And this will include both scarcity pricing of water and technological solutions that reduce water use within homes and businesses. Adaptive reallocation of water that allows emergency transfers when needed may also offer another solution to ensure against severe drought. And finally, better urban planning is also sorely needed. For example, recycling wastewater and harvesting stormwater can provide alternative water supplies that have environmental benefits. And if cities were redesigned or reimagined to resemble sponges, they could capture and soak up runoff and store water below ground. And such innovative designs could improve urban water security and build resilience to climate change. So the policy challenge ahead of us is how can we turn the water crises of today into opportunities for building resilience? Context really matters, but the menu of options we have seen so far broadly follow the principles of the 3 Ps. Protect livelihoods in the origin, provide people-centered investments, and preserve and sustain water resources in the destination. One can think of these menu of options as a chain of policies that are linked together, starting from managing water risk right from the water source itself, and then across the rural-urban continuum from the farms to the cities where most migrants move to. And along this chain of policies, and at the heart of it, are the ebb and flow of people. And it is for this reason that policies that focus on reducing water risks and the impacts of water shocks must be complemented by strategies that broaden opportunities and build the long-term resilience of communities. Doing so will give people more agency to determine the best outcome for themselves, not just to survive, but thrive wherever they may choose to locate. So with that, let me end. Thank you so much for your attention. And let me hand it over to my colleague, Eduardo Borgomeo, a water resources specialist in the World Bank's water practice, who will tell us about Ebb and Flow Volume 2, that focuses on the Middle East and North Africa.
Many thanks, Isha. And I will be presenting volume 2 on behalf of the team, Anders Jakersgaard, Isha Zaveri, Jason Russ, Amjad Khan, and Richard Amania. Let me start sharing now. So volume 2 addresses a subset of the issue of water and migration and development, and that is the role that conflict plays in these dynamics. And volume 2 looks at a regional case, that of the Middle East and North Africa, which is, as you know, unfortunately, the poster child of these issues of water scarcity, forced displacement, and conflict. And when I say Middle East and North Africa, I should clarify that I'm going to be using the World Bank's classification, which does not include countries such as Turkey, Iran, and Sudan. So the first thing to note about the volume 2 of Ebb and Flow is that it really deals with the movement of people that run away from conflict and violence in their countries. And in the Middle East and North Africa, this means people that cross international borders. As you know, those are known as refugees. Think of Syrians in Jordan or Syrians in Turkey. Some of the refugees cross borders within the Middle East and North Africa. Some others cross borders that take them to other regions, such as Europe. There are 7.2 million refugees originating from the Middle East and North Africa as we speak, and there are at least 12.4 internally displaced people. Those are people that, again, flee violence and conflict in their own countries, but stay within these same countries. So the region is facing this unprecedented challenge of protracted forced displacement. And the report tries to understand how this protracted forced displacement and conflict crisis links to water. And really the key question is that we want to understand what are the faces that water has in these situations of forced displacement and conflict. We look at three of these faces. The first one is perhaps the one that you most often hear about, and that is water insecurity as a driver of conflict and also cooperation. Then we look at water as a casualty of conflict, and then finally, the issue of water as a source of vulnerability for the forcibly displaced. And I should also clarify that compared to volume 1 of Ebb and Flow, in this volume 2, we do not employ econometrics and machine learning. We employ a different approach, which is based more on qualitative analysis of existing data sets to synthesize them in a way that then allows us to understand what are the most salient issues for policy and for designing water sector interventions in this context. And so for people that are familiar with the water and conflict literature, some of the things that I will be saying may not be so new, but again, the emphasis here is trying to unpack what is really essential for water sector interventions in this context. So if we address then the first theme, water as a driver of conflict and cooperation, we typically, again, think of man as the poster child, the classical example of water scarcity driving conflict and mass migration. One finding from the report is that we need to be cautious when considering these linkages. We really need to step back and also try and understand the role of policy failures in managing water-related risks, the role that these policy failures can have in triggering this conflict and population movement. So one finding from the report is really we cannot blame droughts for some of these forced displacement crises that we're seeing across the Middle East and North Africa. And as we have learned with the COVID-19 crisis, really learning from data to draw general conclusions requires us to look at as much data as we can and not isolated examples. So this is what we tried to do in this report, to really look at the question as water historically been linked more to conflict or cooperation. To answer the question, we look at historical databases that were built by Oregon State University and the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. These researchers essentially counted water-related events in the Middle East and North Africa, and then categorized these events depending on whether they were conflictive or cooperative. And they did that both for events that involved international parties, so between countries, as well as events that were domestic, so within countries, involving communities in a single country. An example of an international event is two countries signing an agreement to resolve a water dispute. And that would be, of course, a cooperative outcome. A domestic example of an event that's conflictive might be a municipality cutting water supplies to a neighborhood which houses opponents. So what do we see from this historical data? We see that cooperation is a more frequent outcome than conflict in the Middle East and North Africa. So when it comes to water, actually, it seems that, as observed also in other parts of the world, long exposure to water scarcity actually strengthens water users' preference for cooperation. And this is the result that you see in the pie charts here. Of course, and I say, of course, this does not mean that water-related issues are not do not lead to conflictive outcomes. You can see them in these pie charts here, both in international and domestic cases. We also record occurrences of conflictive outcomes. The message from this slide here is really that we should not forget that water is also an enabler of cooperation, and we should therefore not just think that it's all about conflict. But when water is indeed, when water-related events are indeed related to conflict, what we see is that water is not a driver of conflict. It's actually very often a casualty of conflict in the Middle East and North Africa. And this is the second aspect of this water forced displacement conflict nexus that we examine in the report. And so the World Bank has found that in Syria, for example, 457 of the water supply and sanitation assets of the country were destroyed in the civil war. This has a clear implication, as you can imagine, this has clear implications for access to water supply and sanitation services, and therefore to public health risks. The destruction of water infrastructure clearly increases the risks of waterborne disease transmission. And in the report, we also show data produced by the University of New Hampshire and Duke University, and we have Professor Sowers in the panel today. They mapped very usefully the instances of water infrastructure targeting across regional conflicts in Syria, Yemen, and Libya. And as you see in the bar chart on the right, the number of these events that they record in the database has been increasing. So we see a concerning trend of water being a casualty of conflict in the Middle East and North Africa. And obviously, when the water infrastructure is destroyed and when people are forced to flee their homes, they also face a series of water-related challenges. And this is the third aspect that we feel is very relevant for policy at the intersection of water, conflict, and displacement. In what ways does water determine the vulnerability of the people on the move? And to answer that question, to understand this vulnerability, we developed a typology of location. This is similar to what was done in volume 1. Where do the forcibly displaced go? Do they go in camps? Do they stay in the cities and informal settlements in the country of origin? So those are especially the internally displaced people. Or are they refugees? So do they go in cities and informal settlements in country of arrival? This typology helps us to identify a set of water-related challenges, and some of them are different depending on the location. So the first one is camps. And this is obviously, when we think about people fleeing conflict, we immediately think about refugee camps. But actually, interestingly, in the Middle East and North Africa, most forcibly displaced actually reside in urban communities. So you should not forget that the MENA refugee and displacement crisis is really an urban crisis. Most people live in informal settlements in cities. About 10 to 20% live in camps, and they face increased risks from flash floods, and also people with disability living in camps have particular troubles accessing water because of physical barriers. Then if we go into the cities and informal settlements in the country of origin, those are people that have to face daily the fact that the water infrastructure is being targeted and destroyed. The example from Yemen is staggering, as you know, 18 million people without access to safe drinking water. But also in Syria and Libya, we find evidence of people struggling to access sanitation services. And in Libya, also not being able to afford water because the water tankers charge them much more than they can afford. And then finally, the cities and informal settlements in country of arrival. Again, we find lots of evidence of the water challenges faced by Syrians residing in Lebanon and Jordan in relation to water quality and also affordability, and also for international migrants in Libya. So the report provides an overview of these three aspects of the water conflict force displacement nexus: water as a driver of conflict and cooperation, water as a casualty of war, and water as a source of vulnerability for the forcibly displaced. The report takes an historical look, and so it's important, of course, to emphasize that conditions are changing. So these dynamics that we describe in the report are also subject to the impacts of climate change, increased in water scarcity, and in the occurrence of extreme events, and also to the changing nature of conflict. As you know, increasingly war is being fought with drones, with cyber attacks, and also with highly explosive weapons, which typically induce more damage in urban environments and therefore to the urban water infrastructure on which people depend. But now, looking forward, we should also clearly not forget that water in the context of conflict and force displacement is also an opportunity to build resilience. And so the final section of the report and the presentation really tries to understand in what ways can water be an enabler of resilience in this context characterized by conflict and force displacement. And to understand how to build these opportunities, we first consider the issue of spatial scale. And what we suggest is in context where there is a lack of social fabric, there is a lack of trust in institutions, and there is also an overall negative impact of conflict and forced displacement, strained social relations between communities and between communities and the state. We should not start big. So national building blocks interventions such as large infrastructure or large institutional interventions might not be the best bet. In this context, we suggest it's better to start from people and area-based interventions, so geographically targeted interventions, which seek to empower and build the skills of the people whose livelihoods depend on water or whose access to water needs to be restored. An example would be public work programs to reverse the degradation of watersheds, or other labor-intensive approaches to monitor and clean up water resources, which also build the skills of the people who are going to use the water. And then, as we progress over the scale, you can think of these spatially. Of course, national building blocks interventions are clear in the medium term and very important. And on the construction of infrastructure, water infrastructure in areas affected by conflict, it's important also to, in the design of this infrastructure, consider that this same infrastructure might be targeted again, and therefore there should be a preference for redundancies, contingency plans, and also infrastructure that can run even partially if targeted. And then the regional perspective at the end in the long term is clear, because there is a need to coordinate interventions across borders. We've just discussed that refugees move across borders, and therefore regional coordination is essential. So one policy recommendation is really around this issue of spatial scale of intervention, and then building up from the area-based to the regional perspective. The second one is on the issue of temporal scale. Time is very important. Obviously, we all know this. What we decide now impacts where we end up in the future. This is quite obvious. Is the issue of lock-in. And in the context of a protracted forced displacement crisis, we identify 3 points when decisions need to be made. And if we take the wrong decision, we might end up in a path that takes us towards water insecurity or unsustainable use of the resource. We identify 3 decision points. The first one is prevention and pre-crisis coordination planning. Actors involved, such as humanitarian actors, security actors, development actors, and obviously national governments, need to get together to establish functional links and exchange information so that when the crisis comes, they're better able to work together and not undermine each other's efforts. The second decision point is responding to protracted forced displacement. During the crisis, it's really important to not forget that short-term fixes can actually undermine long-term sustainability efforts. For example, uncontrolled expansion of wells to meet the water needs of a refugee camp might actually cause unwanted pollution or unwanted depletion of that same aquifer over the medium term. So it's important during the crisis to never forget about the long-term sustainability objectives of resource management and service delivery. And then finally, the third decision point, following a protracted forced displacement crisis, new economic realities might arise, and also people in some instances might not decide to return, and therefore there is a need really coordinate responses regionally so as to cater for the new reality that has been generated by conflict and forced displacement. So I will conclude now with just essentially a short, quick concluding message from the report is that really what we suggest is that when we consider water in the context of protracted conflict and displacement, there are many important dimensions to consider. Of course, the one that we all know of, which is water as a contributing factor to conflict and forced displacement. But really, this is not the perhaps not most important dimension. Water is also a casualty of conflict. It's a primary source of vulnerability for the displaced, and it's also an opportunity for post-conflict reconstruction and cooperation. Thank you, and back to Joel.
Thanks very much, Edu, and Michel as well. We're going to come back to you with a few questions, but first I want to turn to the panel and let me briefly introduce them. Richard Ellerman is the head of politics at the Technology Center in Catalona. Professor Jeannie Sowers is the department chair and professor of political science at University of New Hampshire. And Ana Maria Ibanez is a principal economic advisor in one of the vice presidencies at the Inter-American Development Bank. And what we're going to do here is just ask a question of each, ask you to try to summarize in about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll move on to the next question. So Richard, if I can ask you to turn on your camera and let me pose the question as you're doing that. The decision to migrate, obviously, as we've talked about, is complex and nuanced. And volume 1 shows that the popular image of droughts or floods driving waves of migrants to safer grounds can certainly be quite misleading. Many are simply unable to move. So how can such evidence contribute to the societal debate on migration, which is often emotionally charged and politically divisive?
Yeah, well, first of all, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everybody. And thank you very much for asking me to participate in this debate. And also my congratulations to the writers of Ebb and Flow for both volumes, which have brought up some vital points. And I think have clarified in an extremely lucid way the challenges which we face. As a doctor in political science and as a former politician myself, I would say that also there are certain questions which have been left open, but which have been presented as a result of this report. The first one I would say is, the first question I would ask is, will migration or the capacity to migrate actually become a privilege in the future? And I think that this is something that perhaps isn't normally considered, that migration or the capacity to migrate is actually something that is not within the reach of everybody. As has been very clearly pointed out by the report, age, gender, education, family size, marital status are all extremely important factors with regards to the capacity of somebody taking the decision to migrate or not. So the other question then is, what happens to those who can't migrate? What happens to those who don't migrate and who obviously as a result form part of the most vulnerable section of the community, of the world community? So these are essential issues which need to be addressed, and which I think that this report certainly brings to light very effectively, together with as well something from volume 2, which I know we're not really talking about at the moment, but volume 2 demonstrates very clearly that water is a casualty of conflict. It's probably not the principal cause of conflict. However, we can say that it is a weapon that where water is scarcer, the more potent that weapon will be. And this is something that with regards to climate change will become more extreme in the future. With regards to volume 1, going back to the question about what happens with regards to policy and migration, I think the essential sentence has come out already with the description that both Esha and Eduardo made about the report, was the point of long-term policies. In order to establish long-term policies as a global society, and for example, I'm based in Catalonia, so therefore my area of interest is principally the Mediterranean and the Near East and the Middle East. And I would say that the most important thing that we must establish is a social political consensus, a non-partisan consensus. And that's very easy to say, but extremely difficult to achieve in a world where increasingly we are becoming as a species more nationalist, more partisan, and more divided than perhaps we have been over the last 50 or 60 years. So therefore, the challenge does become even greater. I think that what is very important is that as a social debate and the questions that have been raised by Ebb and Flow as a report, I think it is absolutely essential that we do realize that we need to include what politicians or political students describe as the quintuple helix. That is, i.e. all the sectors of society from the very beginning. We live in a world where policy is basically dictated by both corporate interest and by political party interest. And that is always by nature short-term. They're looking at short-term gain. They're looking at the dates of the next elections. We as society cannot, and this report demonstrates very clearly that with regards to water and migration, we cannot permit ourselves the luxury of working with short-term reactive policies. So we need to become a proactive society and a long-term society where we are creating policies that will have decades of continuity in order to be built and then to further construct on the basis of those foundations already established. In order to do that, we need to include the public sector, the private sector. We need to include the citizens themselves. We need to include the research sector, and we also need to include the cultural sector, which creates this emotional bond, which can actually create at both a local, national, and international level a social consensus that is obviously required. And I think that that is the principal message which I have taken. Escher was describing the need for the 3 Ps, the need to protect livelihoods at the place of origin, the need to provide people-centered investment, and the need to preserve the urban resources, which are very often the destinations. But in order to do that, we cannot afford party politics, we cannot afford to have nationalistic politics, and we cannot afford to have short-term views. And unfortunately, those 3 things are what dominate the political social context, not only in the Mediterranean, but probably around the globe as well.
Thanks, Richard. Very interesting points and relevant to a whole number of things we're looking at in the water sector. Let me turn to Jeannie. As Volume 2 discusses, water infrastructure in the Middle East and North Africa region is often targeted and destroyed during conflicts. As a result of this, what are the long-term implications of infrastructure targeting for rebuilding states and sustaining livelihoods going forward? And what actions can international partners take to reduce the impact of infrastructure targeting on these livelihood and economies as we go forward?
Great. I hope you can all hear me. I wanted to share a few slides to help structure my few minutes that I have to answer these complex and difficult questions. And like the previous panelist, I wanted to thank the authors of the report for writing such an insightful 2 volumes that really kind of looks at water and conflict and migration from many different perspectives. And I'm going to echo some of their themes and maybe bring in a few other ideas by really thinking about how conflict and infrastructure and water play out in places like Yemen. So in doing so, I'm going to build on some work that my colleague Erica Weinthal and I have been doing over the past several years, looking at the targeting of infrastructure in the Middle East and North Africa, of which water is one of these sort of instances. So let me just see if I can move my screen. Hold on for 1 second. There we go. So I just want to step back and remind us all, as we know, that the extension and integration of water infrastructures and energy infrastructures, which are tightly coupled in the Middle East and North Africa, were essential to post-colonial state building. They were essential to building legitimacy, and the undermining of those systems also accounts for some of the failures of states that we've seen in the region. The creation of these national level centralized projects also created new vulnerabilities for various populations, as we've seen in the post-2011 conflicts, particularly with the intensity of urban warfare that we've seen, where single points of failure can actually take out half of the electricity or water for an entire city or territory. And I also want to just mention that, of course, this process of extending infrastructure in water and in energy also marginalized other regions. And we're all familiar with rural-urban bias, and particularly the dominant position of many capitals in the Middle East and North Africa. So at the same time that post-colonial regimes were extending infrastructure and bringing services to many, many more people, they were also actively marginalizing and neglecting other areas. As was already mentioned, when we look at the post-2011 uprisings and civil wars, we see that infrastructures of all types have been often an object of violence. And this has been both intentional and unintentional by the parties to the conflict, both states, local regimes, external proxy forces, international states that are supporting parties to the conflict, and that in these conflicts, more rarely, water infrastructures have been weaponized, but certainly not as frequently as they have simply been objects of violence. And reconstruction in these contexts is also a very political and politicized process in which the new reconstruction or extension or rehabilitation of infrastructure is sometimes war conducted by other means. So it's good to keep in mind when we're talking about sort of technical questions of investment that these are highly political questions. And I also just want to highlight that what we've seen since 2011 is that even armies that abide by international humanitarian law and other international legal regimes also have exploited the ambiguities of these legal regimes to engage in either intentional or unintentional targeting of civilian infrastructures, including water, under the doctrines of military necessity, collateral damage, and dual use. So if we look briefly at Yemen, I just wanted to emphasize that water was actually the least targeted infrastructure if we look at single events. And if we look at just single events, then targeting of the agricultural system in many different ways, whether farms or fishing boats or grain processing plants or poultry farms, was actually the most frequent type of infrastructure targeted. But frequency doesn't tell us the significance of targeting water or energy, because water systems can serve often entire communities and sometimes entire provinces, and the same with energy. So although they are targeted less frequently, the magnitude of their impacts is very, very significant. So what are some of the impacts, as I was asked to talk about, the long-term implications of targeting infrastructure in protracted conflicts? And the first thing I want to say is that infrastructure interacts with, of course, many other features of these conflicts, which are equally, if not more important. And these include regimes of sanctions, blockades, and of course, price movements that the World Bank and other international institutions document that undermine human security. And in addition, in the protracted conflicts, what we see is not just these acute instances of events targeting that we have done in our work, but we also see, as the International Committee on the Red Cross has really been trying to emphasize, the long-term cumulative degradation of infrastructural assets. And that comes from the loss of the skilled personnel who run them, operate and maintain them, from the deferral of needed maintenance and operation, and also the lack of spare parts and consumables to reconstruct these systems. We don't know exactly how the targeting of infrastructure leads to a number of implications and consequences that I just want to mention, but it seems clear that there's a correlation, right? So one place that we need to think more about is how do we show how infrastructures and how adverse outcomes are linked? So we do know that when water and sanitation systems are either destroyed or degraded, it does contribute to incentives for internal displacement, as was discussed earlier, and it hinders prospects for returns. This is particularly significant in countries like Yemen, where 12% of the total population is internally displaced and where many people do not have the means to move. So referring back to the earlier question that was just raised about the significance of trapped populations. The other thing about undermining infrastructure, particularly in water and agriculture, which are of course tightly linked, is that it undermines resilience of communities to natural hazards, whether these are cyclones, droughts, or floods. Floods in particular have been extremely destructive in Yemen, for internally displaced populations who had to relocate into areas subject to flooding in wadis and riverine and sort of flash floods. The other thing is that it basically degrades rural livelihoods by limiting opportunities for income and employment. This particularly has a gendered impact in agriculture in countries like Yemen that are still primarily agricultural in terms of their employment. Women do the vast majority of unpaid labor on household farms. As we've also seen in Yemen, the destruction of infrastructure or the degrading of this infrastructure in protracted conflicts will likely have contributed to some of the largest cholera outbreaks that have been ever recorded. That was in Yemen starting in 2017 to the present. There's basically a long-running intensification of cholera infections. And of course, with COVID-19, the requirements for wash and sanitation have simply, again, not been able to be met. And the right-hand chart shows you epidemiological models that estimate the true instances of cases in Yemen, because of course, testing is entirely inadequate. So to wrap up, what can international partners do? And asking an academic for their laundry list of policy things we'd like to see is a hazardous enterprise, because we are not involved in the daily practice and we don't understand the constraints that your institutions are under. So bear with me, and with some humility, I'm going to put a few suggestions forward. And the first is to continue the work that the bank and others are already doing to basically enhance coordination and planning between humanitarian development actors and local populations who are already affected by water and conflict. And there is initiatives underway to build a shared data exchange on infrastructure targeting that would bring together academics, humanitarians, and development practitioners. And one purpose of that should be to explore mechanisms of accountability. So one thing that's very striking in these discussions is that it's very difficult to attribute who does what in regards to water or energy or agricultural infrastructure. And it's even harder to actually hold people accountable and governments. So this is a sort of avenue in which we should be thinking about. I would also encourage development banks to continue to provide critical, empirically based analyses of large-scale water and infrastructure projects and do their best to ensure that local stakeholders and experts, local experts, are included, because regimes in the region often do not want to hear that kind of input. Excuse me, and also to plan for what Hibbu Abu Bakr, in talking about Beirut, has called the conflict yet to come. That is to design and invest in resilient infrastructure for water and other needs, to foster investments that employ renewable energy and conserve resources, both which are extremely scarce, even though there are trade-offs, as we know about from experience in Yemen, and also to explore approaches to water, sanitation, and agriculture that seek to not keep people in place through further development of simply the same kind of agriculture, but as was mentioned earlier, new forms of agricultural investment that can diversify rural livelihoods, and also a focus, as the bank already has, on restoring and rehabilitating ecosystem services. So again, wonderful job on the report, and I so enjoyed reading it. Thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you.
Thanks, Jeannie, and we could have done a whole nother session just on your final slide, so I appreciate the inputs and how concisely you presented that. Anna Maria, I want to turn to you, and I want to ask just a question kind of on government and how we invest in infrastructure going forward. As the report shows, some people face a triple jeopardy: exposure to climate risk, reduced economic opportunities, and an inability to move. In such cases, there's questions of whether the government should continue investing in high climatic risk areas or provide incentives to relocate. Should we build back better, or should we be looking at ways to build back in different environments?
Thank you, Joel. And first, I would like to congratulate Desha, Eduardo, and their colleagues for really a timely, rigorous, and interesting publication. The recently published report of the IPCC made even more salient the challenges that lay ahead for all of us, and how water will play a central role of the adaptation to climate change. So the report we are discussing today is hugely important. Before going into the discussion or the specific questions that you asked, Joel, I would like to highlight some conclusions of the report and go into more depth on some issues that need more research in the near future from my point of view. First, the report makes evident that uncertainty attached to the changing climate is huge. So although we have better and more rigorous knowledge on the potential consequences, the uncertainty is really still large. For example, when the report shows the ranges on the likely changes on rainfall in Africa, and these are still too wide to make wide decisions and geographically granular investments. So there is a lot of uncertainty attached on also what we need to do. Second, it is clear that a changing climate will push people to move and force others to stay. And this last part is very important. The decision to migrate or stay is highly correlated with household income and economic development at the geographical level, and the report shows this quite well. So similarly to the current pandemic, what we will see is that the capacity of people to adjust will depend on the region. And this will deepen even more inequality within and very importantly so across countries. Third, the report focuses on internal migration, but international migration is important and relevant as well. So there is international migration due to climatic shocks, and this will rise, adding strain to that caused by forced migration from conflict. Even though most of the current research has concentrated on the effects of international migration for developed countries, 85% of refugees are relocated in developing countries. So the climate crisis is really like a global responsibility in which developed countries have a high share. And a discussion on how to share the global consequences of this crisis should continue and incorporate in a more concrete way climate migration. In a preliminary paper that we're doing with Andrea Velázquez and Jimena Romero, we are studying the international migratory responses of households in El Salvador to extreme weather events. And what our paper finds, and here we have causal estimates, is that increases in temperature increases international migration for agricultural households. And the impact that we find is quite large. So an additional week of temperature levels above 2 standard deviations of the historical levels increases migration by about 25%. And fourth, and I think this is important and it was not addressed in the report or is not addressed in depth in the report, is that we need to take into account the general equilibrium effects of international migration. Some studies for forced migration, for example, in Colombia, show that the flows of forced migrants impoverished even more the urban poor by reducing wages of informal workers and increasing housing rents. Lastly, and really in line with Richard's comments, I fully agree with the report that we need to understand better what happens with the households trapped in the regions with high frequency of water shocks and an increasing intensity of those. Research concentrates on the movers and little we know about the stayers, and we need to understand that. Now, on your question, very quickly, migration is really an important strategy to mitigate the impacts of negative income shocks, as I mentioned, when absent financial and insurance markets to mitigate its effect. In this case, policies should aim to prevent distress migration by promoting access to financial and insurance markets, improving the provision of public goods, such as the one that Esha mentioned, and providing technical assistance to producers, for example, agricultural producers. But migration is also a way out of poverty and a way to go out of regions that become unlivable and are no longer feasible. And in these cases, policies really should aim to reduce the obstacles of migration, including international migration. So I really don't believe that we should be asking ourselves whether we should invest in people or places. We should be investing in both, as the report rightly shows and discusses. And so the reports provide really several policies and investments that should start now. These investments will not only prevent distress migration, but will also help to improve income and productivity in these countries. But we should also provide households with the necessary elements to make their location decisions freely. And here I stress that, and not constrained by lack of resources due to the high cost of migration. And as I said, these effects will not only affect the people facing the climate risk, but urban dwellers as well, and importantly, the most vulnerable ones. So investments should therefore take into consideration the general equilibrium effects of this migration. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Ana Maria, and thanks to Richard and Jeannie as well. Look, we have about 3 minutes. I'm going to turn to Richard for the last word because I have one follow-on question, but I want to thank Isha and Edo and all of the authors. This has been a fantastic study. We hope it's read far and wide, and we're very appreciative for everyone attending today, and also to the panelists for the great comments. And we could have gone on for quite some time. But Richard, on the way out, and you only have 2 minutes, I'm afraid, but there was a lot of talk about water being more around cooperation rather than conflict in some of these areas. And I particularly want to ask you about whether you see what this means in terms of water in related to media and in other areas of policy, particularly in the Mediterranean region. So can you close us out in 2 minutes, please? Thank you. And thanks to everybody for participating.
Yes, very quickly, I'll try to end on an optimistic note. So despite the fact that due to water, due to migration, due to especially the perceived international migration, which this report demonstrates isn't actually true, but social media has certainly been extremely damaging to all of the issues that we've been discussing this evening. What I would suggest, however, is that water can, despite social media, despite rising nationalism, despite rising phobias, which have been appearing, especially in Europe and in the Western world in general, water, for example, certainly can be a natural source of collaboration. An example is something that we've created through the United Nations World Water Quality Alliance, the social engagement platform which I lead. We're working with local communities, and we're discovering that when you get underneath the national radar, as it were, and you're working with local communities, with municipalities, you can work together across borders. So we've been forming local water forums where the quintuple helix, all of the representatives of society in specific municipalities, be they cities, towns, or villages, have been coming together, creating water-orientated projects and policies which have a continuity because they have a social consensus right from the beginning, because they're truly engaging their people. But more surprising to us is that this has become a form of science diplomacy, whereby cities or municipalities, small towns or villages have been working together with their counterparts in areas which traditionally would be their enemies. And perhaps the clearest example has been the work that we have been able to undertake, for example, between the city of Jerusalem, the city of Tel Aviv, the city of Ramallah in Palestine, and the city of Amman. It's one example that we are seeing both in the Mediterranean region, but also beyond, where water seen as a common purpose, a common resource, an absolute necessity for life, is being used to be able to create connections and links between different communities who otherwise would be opposing each other for different reasons. And again, I think it's very important to stress that this has been managed under the national radar. We've been working with the local communities in a strategy where we look to put supranational ambitions and turn them into local municipal implementation. I think that that's at least an optimistic note to think of, to ponder and to conclude this with.
Thanks for the optimism, and thanks everyone for participating in a great session, and to you, the panelists and the authors. Have a good evening and enjoy the next sessions. Bye-bye.